Okay, so today we are going to begin by focusing on the beginnings of South Carolina as a colony. You're going to see how you can actually think of South Carolina as a colony of a colony. We're going to explain that within this video. But hopefully at this point too, you are beginning to understand the indicator of 813. As you can see, it tells you that the student will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the establishment of the Carolina colony as a distinctly Southern colony. So you're really going to have to know, how did it begin and how does it fit the bill as a distinctly Southern colony. So let's start off by talking about the Lords Proprietors. And so, of course, this is just the pluralization, talking about all of these different Lord Proprietors, individuals. You can see Anthony Ashley Cooper on the right as being one of these significant people, even as far as his connection with John Locke, which we'll talk about. But let's just start off with some general information. Of course, it tells you that the land in the Americas that would later become South Carolina was given to a group of English noblemen by King Charles II as a repayment for debts. So when you talk about the word proprietor, of course, you're talking about an owner of a business or property. So these noblemen, which of course they were of a higher social ranking, which is why they have the title nobleman, called the Lords Proprietors, wanted to use this Carolina colony to make money. And so what this meant is that they were going to have to figure out how to get settlers to come to Carolina in order to grow cash crops. And when you're talking about cash crops, of course, whenever you think South Carolina, you're going to think rice and indigo. And so they had to figure out how they were going to get people to come to this area. And one of the things that they decided that they were going to do was to charge a quitrent or a land tax in order to make money off of the people that came to the New World, to this colony. Now, you had the establishment of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. And first of all, it was written by John Locke. And when you think of John Locke, you should think of him as being one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. He had this belief in limited government and the right to own property, and his ideas, of course, would later on influence the Declaration of Independence. But he had this concept that involved 3 natural rights, if you remember that from last year. And with him specifically, it was life, liberty, and property. He also had this idea of social contract, which meant when the government fails to secure those natural rights that were mentioned earlier with life, liberty, and property, that citizens can actually withdraw their obligation to obey or even to kind of change their leadership. And so Locke was a perfect person to write this document. He was actually doing this as a service to Anthony Ashley Cooper, and I want you to think of it as like him being like a paid secretary, or in the same way that like a lawyer would write a will. That's how he wrote this document. So you may think, well, what is his affiliation with the Carolina colony? Well, it's simply that. He was just doing a job. But it said that this was used by the Lord Proprietors to attract wealthy settlers to the Carolinas. And so this allowed them to set up the government of the South Carolina colony in order to decide how decisions were going to be made. So mainly this was done just to decide who would have the most power. Now, if you just want to talk the specific provisions of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, it's basically just these simple things. First of all, you have religious tolerance, which of course is going to attract many different kinds of people, and you're going to see that later on as far as having settlers from France or Switzerland, Germany, Scotland. It also helped to set up a class system, which actually put the wealthy landowners at the top, if you think about these rich plantation owners. These people as well, these wealthy landowners, would have the most political power in the colony. The Lords Proprietors, of course, would have the ultimate authority in government. However, it did give some say to the colonists, which would make it somewhat attractive to these people coming to this area. When you think about this social class system, it's called the headright system. And of course it says here the headright system led to really rich plantation owners having huge amounts of land, which of course is why they're at the top. When you're talking about the headright system, it's just really granting land to the settlers in the 13 colonies. Like it was roughly 50 acres that these people would be given, and it was just a way to attract settlers to the new region and even to begin to address the labor shortage that they would face there. Plantation owners purchased large amounts of slaves to work on plantations to grow the cash crops. And whenever you talk about cash crops, you're talking about the main two, of course, with rice, which is also called Carolina gold, and then indigo, which is a valuable blue dye that we're going to address in your next video. But you can begin to see the social class system with the rich plantation owners making up a smaller portion of the population, but with the most power. You have your middle class, and then of course you have your slaves, which make up most of the population, even of South Carolina, which was uncommon in comparison to the other colonies as well, but they made up the biggest population of this particular colony. Now, with the first settlers, it tells you, of course, here that the first settlers to come to South Carolina under the Lords Proprietors were English plantation owners from Barbados, and this was another English colony. And so if you think about it at this time, and you think about the social stratification that you just saw, most of your population were slaves. In fact, it was like 60% at one point during this time. And like I said earlier, this was the only colony where this existed, where slaves were the majority. And so from Barbados, these people brought the plantation system. They brought the first African slaves to South Carolina, slave laws, which later developed. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you attracted different settlers because of this from all these different places. But I want you to make that connection between Barbados and South Carolina because you had all of this coming specifically from there. And so this tells you that Barbados is a small island in the Caribbean, which is also known as the West Indies. And English settlers, of course, with exploration and just establishing these settler colonies that we talked about, they'd already set up plantations there even before the founding of South Carolina. So in conclusion, just some basic things that I want you to consider. There were the Lords Proprietors, who of course were the first quote-unquote owners of South Carolina. So technically it was more like a business company with the proprietor system that was set up. They tried to establish a government in South Carolina that would make as much money as possible. How can we attract people here and address the economic issue that we would be facing? They believed that creating a government that attracted wealthy landowners to grow cash crops on the plantation would make the most money through this tax. That's the quitrent land tax that we had mentioned earlier. And also the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, written by John Locke, essentially decided who would do what jobs, who would have the most say in government, and how certain groups of people were allowed to live their lives.